Um, Thank you for showing up. I would like to just do the welcome again, just for people who may have shown up recently. So this is a meeting of the South Park Coalition, a team of neighbors working together to make this a safer, cleaner, and friendlier neighborhood. All South Park residents are welcome to join us, and it's a great opportunity to meet your neighbors and get out and have some fun. Tonight, we've had three candidates from the Sonoma County for this office of Sonoma County Sheriffs coming to speak with us. We had Dave Edmonds, followed by Carl Tenenbaum, and now we have Kevin Burke. Each of them have been given half an hour to speak, followed by a question and answer period. There has been some question as to why I did not invite all of the candidates. I would like to be very clear. I did not invite any of the candidates. Each of these candidates contacted us in the weeks and months before this event took place. Over the weekend, another candidate asked to join, and I said it was too late to accommodate him because I knew we were already going into an hour-and-a-half meeting, and I've done these meetings with our neighborhood before, and they don't do very well after an hour, generally speaking. So if there's interest, I'm more than happy to have another meeting, but we have three great candidates tonight, and that's what we have. Because of the limited time, I have a list of questions that I will ask. If we have additional questions, you can put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them, and if we don't get to them, we will forward them to the candidates for them to respond. With that, I'm going to introduce Kevin Burke. Kevin served as a police chief of Healdsburg from 2011 to 2021, after serving as police chief in Lakeport for 4 years. His previous experience was in the LA Police Department, and before that as a prosecutor in Los Angeles area. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Whittier College, a law degree from the University of California at Berkeley, and a master's degree in public safety management from Johns Hopkins University. If elected, Kevin would seek to build relationships with members of the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors, the broader community, and the independent office of Law Enforcement Review and Outreach, known as IOLERO, which is the office that oversees investigations and citizen complaints. Kevin believes the sheriffs need to be willing to work with IOLERO and to ensure that the will of the voters through Measure P is honored. He likes the idea of creating a sheriff's advisory committee made up of representatives across the community to provide insight about community needs. He believes there are some great men and women working at the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office, and it has been the potential to be a regional leader in terms of best practices. He would like to create a culture of being a learning organization. The voters of Sonoma County want a sheriff who is experienced at bringing people together. They want transparency from law enforcement, accountability, and a leader who has those values. That is what Kevin would bring to the position. And with that, I welcome Kevin to speak to us tonight.
Thank you very much, Annette, and for allowing me to participate. So I wanted to start off by just kind of giving you a sense of who Kevin Burke is, and then I want to leave as much time as possible for questions. Sometimes I think people running for office need to spend more time listening and not talking, so I'll try and be brief as I introduce myself, but I do think people want to know who the candidate is. So I'll start by saying I grew up not far from here. I was born and raised in St. Helena over the hill, raised by my dad, who was a public school teacher there, and raised three kids all by himself. Like a lot of people who grow up in a small town, when I graduated there, I wanted to go off to the big city. So I moved to Los Angeles at that time, went to school at Whittier College, a small school down there, got my major in economics. And I'd already had an interest in law enforcement because I had been an Explorer Scout in St. Helena, just a young kid riding around with the small town officers, and developed a real interest for what they do and started developing a passion for it. So I joined the LAPD as a reserve officer while I was going to college and while I was going to law school as well. As a reserve officer, you work a couple times a month, and you're basically doing the same job as a police officer. It's just kind of more of a learning phase and part-time. So I did that for about 10 years while I was getting my law degree, graduated from law school at Berkeley, passed the bar, went ahead and practiced law privately for a couple of years. Then I became a deputy district attorney, and I liked being a deputy DA, but it wasn't the same. What I found about being a cop is it was this profound sense of contribution that you get when you help people, and I really enjoyed that aspect of law enforcement, helping other human beings and making a difference. And so it kind of got me hooked on the work, and I decided to stop being a lawyer and join the police department full-time, and have never looked back. So with the LAPD, I was blessed to work some challenging assignments in some very busy patrol divisions. At some point, I ended up as a law instructor at the Los Angeles Police Academy. Because of my legal background, they tended to offer me assignments that matched and paired well with that knowledge. So I ended up teaching law at the police academy to recruit, something I enjoyed very much. Eventually promoted to sergeant and got to work some busy patrol divisions as a field supervisor, and then transitioned into some other assignments, vice undercover for a couple of years, working employee relations for a couple of years. And then my last 2 years at the LAPD were as an internal affairs advocate, basically working with the investigators in misconduct cases and presenting those cases on behalf of the department in front of an administrative tribunal for discipline, essentially advocating for discipline in cases that were often serious. And that was a real good learning experience for me. Wrapped up there, took my first police chief job in Lakeport. Loved working in Lakeport, great small community. Everybody knows everybody, really enjoyed my time there. And after a few years there, I wanted to be closer to where I had grown up and take on a little bit larger of an organization. So I applied for the Healdsburg police chief job, a job I held for 10.5 years. And as a police chief, I sort of had a simple recipe for success. And for me, it's always been about connecting with the community, building relationships, not just with the community and with other organizations and business leaders, but also within the organization as well. I think leadership is as much an art as it is a science. I've studied it. I went back to school and got a master's degree at Johns Hopkins University from their police executive leadership program. Took a few years. I had to fly to Baltimore twice a month for 2 years, excepting summer, because it was not, they didn't have distance learning back in 2007. So I'm really excited to get that. It gave me some really good tools for leadership and helped me formulate my leadership style, which is, again, all about relationships, all about trying to get a pulse of what the organization needs, what the community needs, and then endeavor to match those needs. So fast forward to today, I end up deciding to run for Sonoma County Sheriff. I think that my experience, having actually been a leader in law enforcement, having made the tough decisions that go along with sitting in that chair, make me uniquely and well positioned to come into the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office and lead. And I'm excited for the opportunity. Again, I'm passionate about what we do in policing. I have nothing but profound respect for the communities that we serve and for the men and women that do the work. And so I'm excited for the opportunity. I guess I'll talk a little bit about my personal life too. Briefly, I live in Healdsburg by myself with my 2 rescue pit bull mixes, Loomis and Stormy. I'm passionate about animals and animal rescue. That's a big deal for me. In my private time, I like to do volunteer work. For the last few years, actually 5 years, I've been a volunteer for the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, going into San Francisco and working at a clinic there that serves a very diverse community of BIPOC, white, LGBTQ, with specific emphasis on trans, a lot of unhoused clients, also some non-LGBTQ who are unhoused that do our walk-in for testing, mostly HIV and hepatitis C. We do a rapid test result, and then I disclose the results. So I love giving back to the community and being engaged in the community. Excited to have been a part of their mission as well. It's been a little bit on hiatus with COVID, of course. I haven't been able to get into San Francisco and do it as much. So with that, I will stop talking as I promised and leave as much time as possible for whatever questions that your organization has.
All right. Well, I'll be happy to start with a few, and then we can check and chat if we have some other ones. Just to start off with, what do you see as the job of sheriff?
So the sheriff of Sonoma County, the elected sheriff, is the chief law enforcement officer of Sonoma County, supervising and managing, basically the CEO for a very large organization that has multiple responsibilities in the unincorporated areas. It's responsible for primary law enforcement response and patrol, as well as the 2 contract cities. Also in charge of the corrections and custody for our county, running our jail system, and also providing bailiffs in the court system, serving other process matters as well. But it's also important to note that the sheriff is also the chief as it relates to emergency preparedness and in our what we call operational area for emergency preparedness. As you all know, we've been hit very hard by emergencies here in Sonoma County, and the sheriff is instrumental as the leader of our operational area as it relates to emergency planning and response. As an example, it was the sheriff that ordered the large evacuations during the Kincaid fire, which we were part of in Healdsburg. So I have a keen interest in emergency preparing and planning and preparedness. I have the from California Office of Emergency Services. I'm a certified emergency management specialist, which took a lot of work, but I really wanted to understand what that was about and be at the top of my game from emergency planning and preparedness standpoint. So the sheriff has a critical role in that as well. And I also think the sheriff has a critical role in their work with other cities. I had someone say, well, I really don't care about the sheriff's race. I live in the city of X. And again, I had a great conversation with that person explaining that not only do the incorporated cities have a huge role in selecting the sheriff, but the sheriff is a partner in our region with those agencies and at times provides assistance, support, and partnership with those. So the sheriff has a critical role countywide, even in those incorporated cities that have their own law enforcement agencies. So it's a extremely important job, clearly, and I'm excited for the possibility of being able to do it.
Do you think your background as in police work versus in the sheriff's department is going to affect your ability to lead there?
It does impact me in certain ways. Coming from the police chief world, as a police chief, you're not elected. You're very apolitical. So you look at it from that sense. If you're not doing a good job as a police chief, you can't do it for 15 years. They're going to get rid of you. So I come in with that mindset of a passion for kind of ignoring the fact that it's an elected official and focusing on the fact that I'm just there to serve the community. So I bring with me as a police chief that mindset of service to the community, reach out to the community, build those relationships, and behave similarly as I did as a police chief. But I do recognize that there is a different culture, if you will. Every law enforcement agency has a different culture, and the sheriff's office has a different culture than the police department. There are certain key differences. First and foremost, if you're in Healdsburg or Santa Rosa or an incorporated city, oftentimes you might have access to greater resources. Being a law enforcement officer in a unincorporated area or an area of the county that may have large square miles to patrol, you are going to have a different mindset because you may not have available backup and other resources as well. So there are cultural differences. I'm pretty sensitive to that difference as it is because I've spent 5 years almost as a police chief in Lakeport and Lake County. And that taught me a lot about how important it is to work with other organizations and to understand the important differences between city policing and in a sheriff's office. So I think it will be a learning curve for me. I will acknowledge going into the sheriff's office, but I've had the privilege of working very closely with the sheriff's office over my 10.5 years as a police chief in our Law Enforcement Chiefs Association. So I know a fair amount of what they do, and I have a good relationship with that organization as it is. So I should be able to, and I'm confident that I can hit the ground running, even though I come from a police chief background versus a sheriff background.
Okay. How would you improve relations between the sheriff's department and the members of the Latino community?
Great question. There is a significant Latinx community in our county. I would ask you to look at what I did in Healdsburg. I think the best measure of how somebody is going to be as a leader is what they've done in the past. So upon taking that police chief job in Healdsburg, at some point I recognized that we had really engaged the Latinx community, which was 1/3 of our community in Healdsburg, roughly about the same percentage that it is countywide in the county of Sonoma as well. So I started some programs that had never been done before, and importantly, town hall meetings that were completely in Spanish. And that had never been done before. I actually am able to write in Spanish and read in Spanish. It's harder for me to understand Spanish, so I can't take the questions in Spanish very well. I need a translator for that. But I can write my own prepared remarks and read them and actually be understood. So I would address the crowd at those town hall meetings in Spanish as their police chief, and those were very successful events. We rebranded it at some point to a Plática Latina, which was the first events were kind of sterile town halls at City Hall with some bottles of water and snacks, and everybody was standing around, and we had our presentation and PowerPoint slides. And some of the feedback I received after we partnered with the nonprofit Corazon Healdsburg was that we should have an event that fits the community better. So we rebranded it with an event that had food, catered Mexican food, traditional Mexican dancers, and we had a great turnout for that event. Again, I went in and addressed the crowd, and in particular talked about how we would not have a role, because this was after 2016, in immigration enforcement, and wanted to comfort that community in knowing that as a police department, we were not going to be doing any immigration enforcement or partnering with organizations that did. So I think I have a track record of reaching out to that community. I also brought in somebody from the Latinx community to serve on a promotional panel, a very important one inside the police department. I believe in bringing people who have never had the opportunity to come in and do something like that before, from all different segments of the community, a diverse cross section inside the organization, to sit on promotional level panels in addition to the other people you have appraising. And it was a huge success. Basically 2 police chiefs and a local restaurant owner from the Latinx community. And it was a really important promotional piece. So that was a huge success. So I think pieces like that, being involved and engaged and visible in that community, is key. So it's not just about holding events and asking people to come to that, but it's about going out into the community also and engaging the Latinx community on their own spaces as well, and being available and accessible. Because I do think that's absolutely necessary and key for law enforcement to have an important relationship with them.
How do you think that your officers can go in the community and rebuild trust with the members of the community?
So it pains me when I think that there isn't trust in the community, but I acknowledge that there isn't with certain segments of the Sonoma County community. So it starts with the sheriff, who is, again, accessible and visible. One of my ideas is to create a community sheriff's advisory committee that would essentially help the sheriff get the pulse of what various diverse opinions are in the Sonoma County community. Essentially operate as kind of an eyes and ears for the Sonoma County Sheriff. So trust building requires, there's actually research that supports that. Contacts between law enforcement and the community in a non-law enforcement traditional adversarial setting. So what I mean by that is some of the things I've experimented with in Healdsburg, having officers teach at the tennis camp. Again, the whole point is to build trust, that the community sees this person for the human being that they are, in addition to being a law enforcement officer, and that the law enforcement officer also gains positive result from that interaction by seeing the community member on their terms for who they are in a non-adversarial setting. So I think creating opportunities for representatives from the sheriff's office, the sheriff themselves, to interact with people in that way is absolutely crucial to restoring that trust. And again, there is research at Harvard or Yale that absolutely supports that non-enforcement interactions are key. So to that end, I define law enforcement very broadly. To me, stopping at a school to have lunch with kids in the cafeteria is law enforcement. Stopping into a business to introduce yourself as a deputy sheriff and find out what the issues in that area and with that business might be. So those types of interactions should be encouraged, and a culture should be created that validates that that's just as important as, when the community wants to be safe. When someone calls 911 and calls the sheriff's office, calls law enforcement, it's obviously primary to our function that we go and deal with whatever the emergency might be. But equally important when there aren't those occurring is to create those interactions that are non-adversarial, non-enforcement related, to establish and build trust between the two. And I think changing that culture at the organization is something that I would lead and set by example. They would see me out there doing that every day and would go a long way to restoring trust. Transparency is another huge part of restoring trust. And I think that there's sort of a missed opportunity currently by not engaging with IOLERO and partnering with IOLERO so that the sheriff's office can show that they have absolutely nothing to hide. I think a highly functioning, good law enforcement agency should have nothing to hide from the community and should be absolutely willing to share information and be transparent. So I think it would further the trust additionally, in addition to these outreach and positive contacts that aren't enforcement related, to take those steps to show that we have nothing to hide. We're going to cooperate with IOLERO. We're going to share what information we have. Stop data, for example, when I was police chief in Healdsburg, we released stop data a year and a half before it was legally required, because after the George Floyd murder, I realized that we needed to do something to ensure that the community trusted us. So we went ahead and started releasing that data a year and a half before it was required. And so I'm always going to be looking for opportunities like that to do something different so that people will trust their sheriff's office, because it's absolutely critical to the law enforcement role that we do have that community trust.
How would IOLERO improve or assist your efforts to improve community relations?
IOLERO, again, is an opportunity, because if the community sees that we have a shared vision with IOLERO over accountability and over oversight and are willing to partner with them to make that happen, that right off the bat will ensure a high level of community trust. Again, the leader sets the tone. And I think from day one, the elected sheriff needs to go in and shake hands with IOLERO, shake hands with the auditor, have a strong relationship with the CAC. And that by itself, building that relationship and working on how we can take that annual report and make it closer together so that it doesn't have as much conflict over outcomes. And that will go a long way to establish, again, community trust and strengthen that relationship outside. So I think there's an opportunity there for the next sheriff, and one that I will absolutely embrace from day one.
How would you deal with racism in the department?
Well, there is no room for racism in law enforcement, and I have zero tolerance for it. I have a history of accountability that dates back to being a deputy district attorney and working in internal affairs with the LAPD. So I've seen misconduct cases over my experience as a law enforcement officer that deal with that. And I absolutely have no tolerance for it whatsoever. So it starts with that mentality that the sheriff is willing to take action when they learn about it. So there's absolutely no room in law enforcement for racism.
How would you hold deputies accountable for their actions?
That's a fair question. It starts by leading by example. Okay, the first thing a leader has to do is lead by example. Be willing to demonstrate convincingly to them that you embrace accountability, even for yourself. And then you have to communicate expectations. It's kind of a fundamental leadership tenet that you have to express to your staff, this is what accountability means. I think it's important to acknowledge that, in my opinion, the wonderful people, men and women that I've worked with over the years in law enforcement, they want accountability themselves. Your deputies and your officers don't want to see deputies, officers, anybody within an organization doing things that bring a negative impression on the law enforcement organization and reflect poorly and hurt that relationship because they know it makes their job even more difficult. So everybody within an organization has that shared desire for accountability. And as a sheriff, it starts by setting the tone, leading by example, and then being willing to go in and hold people accountable. And I've had to do that as a police chief. I've had to make those very difficult decisions that you have to make in terms of discipline and termination. And those are some of the most challenging things that a law enforcement executive has to do, but it's an important part of the work. So accountability starts with good leadership, communicating expectations, and then following through and being willing to do what's necessary to hold people accountable.
And Santa Rosa Police Department recently launched their In Response program. Would you support something like that for the sheriff's office?
It's a great program. Yeah, it's like the Cahoots model, but elevated even on steroids. It's multidisciplinary. I'm a huge fan. I proposed something like that, but in Healdsburg before I retired, and it's been implemented. We were really one of the first agencies in the county to propose a different model. And I recognized in a meeting in June 2020 that sometimes the best resource to go deal with issues is not a police officer or deputy with a gun. So that's been a fundamental belief of mine for a long time. So I proposed a new program in Healdsburg that was our police equity team, involving the hiring of a social worker, pairing them with a police officer to be the primary responder on issues surrounding the unhoused, drug addiction, mental health issues, and also to do a review from an equitable standpoint of law enforcement policies. Because in my experience, we have neutral policies in law enforcement, but they don't always have the same impact on communities. Take, for example, the impounding of a car. If my car's impounded, I'll pay for it, I'll get it back, and it will impact me in a certain way. But there are some people for whom it might be their place where they're living, or it might be their livelihood, and they may not be able to afford to get it out, and it will have drastic impact. So in Healdsburg, we created that team early on. It's up and running now. It's one of my proud legacies at the Healdsburg Police Department. It's very popular in the community, and so I have a demonstrated track record of embracing those kinds of programs, and I think it should be expanded, something countywide that hopefully partners with everybody on the same team. And I think that's the future of things, is mental health clinicians where necessary, police officers where necessary, and a fine separation between the two.
That's excellent. We have 2 minutes left. Would you like to wrap up anything specific?
Well, I just wanted to say that I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. I think small neighborhood groups like South Park that represent a little tiny piece of Santa Rosa and the Sonoma County community are important voices. And as sheriff, I am committed to getting out and engaging with groups like South Park on a regular basis. I also wanted to say that, again, I have had to make those tough decisions, and having been a police chief for 15 years in 2 different cities, I care about this community that I live in. It's my home. I care about law enforcement, and I just want to serve and make a difference. And I think it's my genuine concern for people and for the work that we do that makes me an exceptional candidate for Sonoma County Sheriff. And I'm really excited for the opportunity. And I hope that the voters will look at my background and what I've actually done and my track record and support me.